Well, Chris, last year we talked about creativity, and I think that, from last year, you've read different books and you've got different insights into creativity. So how has your view of creativity changed over the past year?
Um, well, I came across a book by a chap called Robert Fritz, and he laid down quite a common sense view towards creativity, in that he said that it was sort of part of our humanity to be creative, and we often don't see this as so essential to us, but in fact it is central to our existence in his view, and I think that's a view you share, that we don't bring up children to be creative in an essential way or a central way. We probably look at teaching them art or writing poetry, but not to encompass their whole life. And so that's his central insight. And his book is called The Path of Least Resistance, which had been on my bookshelves, and I tried it earlier, and I hadn't really absorbed what he was saying. So I started rereading it. It's quite an old book. It's probably getting on for 30 years old. So, but what he says still applies today as when he wrote the book.
I suppose it depends on how we define creativity, because in that sense, when people say we're all creative, it's a bit like saying, well, we all have the capacity to learn. In order to survive, we do have to learn. Some people learn more effectively than others, but ultimately, in order to evolve, in order to, as I say, survive so many challenges, that could mean that if we're not adapting appropriately, we wouldn't survive. So in a way, creativity is a process of adaptation, learning to adapt to new contexts and to thrive in different unfamiliar contexts.
That's right, but according to him, what happens to us is we get bogged down in processes and ways of doing things, rather than having a vision and then creating the processes to sustain that vision. So it's really looking as to what are the outcomes we want, and then the ways of putting into place how to achieve those outcomes. I'll give you some examples because I've been involved recently in a couple of ventures that need a little bit of creativity to oil the wheels and get them in motion. So, for instance, I chair a group called the Friends of Edgbaston Reservoir, and I don't know if you've ever been there, Jayshree.
I haven't.
Well, it's quite a lovely spot, about a mile from the city centre, and it's about 70 acres of water, which was there, or is there, to top up the canals. It was constructed by Thomas Telford in the early 19th century, and it's very picturesque. But the problem is it needs to have a certain amount of finance to keep it going. Now, the council, in order to keep it going, have produced a plan which relies on developers coming in and doing things to the reservoir, and in a sense commercializing it in order to keep it going. But at the same time, in our view, it's also going to wreck the reservoir and then wreck its inherent value. So the council are in a bit of a bind, really, because they've been, as you know, in the austerity measures that the government are imposing, they've had a lot of grants taken away from them and are struggling really to keep services going. So their solution to this is to build lots of houses around the reservoir, and I think ultimately to build houses on the reservoir, make it into a sort of urban playground, and in that way generate income from the reservoir. The council have put forward a plan, and so we've decided to counter their plan with an alternative plan. And the alternative plan means taking all the constraints that the council have, generating income and making the reservoir something that we can all be proud of, but taking a different tack altogether. So what it means is that we have to create another vision of the reservoir that keeps it going and makes it of value to the people of Birmingham. And the value of the reservoir is not just the water, but it's also a local nature reserve, and it's also a place of peace and quiet in a very intense urban environment. So there's a lot of inherent value that we can monetize in a lot of ways by getting grants and by putting the reservoir there as a place for future green issues and green technologies that are attractive to future generations.
And I'm sure that those of you who've been working on this alternative plan have been doing so voluntarily because you feel really passionate about this alternative. Am I right in assuming that you're working on this project voluntarily?
Yeah, it's all volunteering, and some professional people giving their services pro bono.
Yes, yeah, because that's usually what it is that you have to be very altruistic. You have to be, there has to be this deep, sincere desire to do good for others. You know, otherwise, like if that isn't there, this alternative wouldn't exist. It exists because you have a group of people willing to collaborate and selflessly serve society, serve the community.
Yeah, and there's a kind of synergy that happens. I mean, people have come together, people we don't know, and surprising people who do hold quite an affection for the reservoir that we didn't know about, and it's sort of generated quite a groundswell of activity. So we've put together a 34-page plan to present to the council. We've presented it, just showing all the alternatives and what could happen with the reservoir, just through discussion, coming together and deciding who's going to do what. And funnily enough, some of the people driving this are artists themselves who know about creating vision and know about putting together something that is holistic and new.
And this seems to be an excellent example of what you're talking about, the path of least resistance, because rather than taking on the council head on and objecting to what they have proposed, instead of protesting, you are not protesting, you are spending all that energy in creating and offering an alternative. So rather than...
Yeah, yes, well put. Because we realise, and a lot of voices of coming from areas of the council have been telling us, don't resist this, put forward a plan that you and the council can cooperate on and make it a collaborative project, rather than getting out the banners, save our reservoir, and jumping in front of bulldozers. We can you know, work together and be productive for once, because we know that if we oppose this plan and it failed, that they'll be round again in a few years' time with another plan to do something with the reservoir. So we know it's there as a prize, a monetary prize for developers, and so we want to put forward a plan that will last and be sustainable, and not just as you say, raise the protest flag and then people regroup and come again. Yeah.
Yes, and it's about creating a win-win solution for everyone. So yes, taking into account a diverse range of stakeholders. So it's not just a question of us against them. It's, well, let's look at this holistically. And as you said, you were surprised at some of the people that have come to support you. You know,
Yeah.
that has happened because you've created this space and opened up the space for people that are not necessarily within your immediate circle.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, the stakeholders is good because there are various interests. I mean, the water users, for instance, they've got an interest. And besides the council, there's the Canals and Rivers Trust, who also have an interest. So we work in collaborative with everybody and make sure we have something that won't fall to bits when we put it forward. Yes.
When people usually talk about stakeholders, you know, what I notice is that in the business world, the number of stakeholders that they take into consideration is quite limited. The stakeholders will be, you know, the people in the immediate vicinity, the competitors, the customers, whereas very people who look at these issues in a more holistic way, they take into account a much broader range of stakeholders, which is not just human stakeholders, it's also the animals and the plants and the water, as you say. And it's like how the action that you're taking, how is that going to have an impact on the actual water? You know, is it going to pollute it or make it purer? How is it going to have an impact on the wildlife, on the, you know, the vegetation in the area? So when you have a group of people coming together who are able to look at things from a much broader perspective, not just from a human point of view, but from an ecological point of view, then there, you know, there may be more synergy, more creativity that emerges from that situation.
Yeah, well, that's one of the paths we're taking, because I know the customary economic business model is, as you say, very restricted and take in all the stakeholders in any situation. It's usually the shareholders, and that's the bottom line, without looking at the workers, the customers, and above all on the environment. And at the end of the day, there's only one economy, and that is the green economy. Because if we destroy that, we've destroyed everything. And so we're bringing the reservoir forward as an emblem, really, of greenery, of what the latest thinking is around green issues. So people are now putting a value on the environment, a monetary value, so that they've done one for the whole of Birmingham. And the green economy in Birmingham is worth about £91 billion.
Sorry about that. Go ahead, Chris.
So the green economy in Birmingham, they've calculated now, is worth about £91 billion. And for every £1 invested, they realize about £24. So the space and the wildlife is actually very precious. But using the reservoir as an example, we could use it as a national place where people can come and see, you know, the work of reed beds to purify the water, ways of preserving the wildlife and increasing the ornithology and the plant life. And so you're right, it is a big issue now, and people are becoming more and more aware of environmental issues with things that are going on with the green exception that everyone's talking about at the moment.
Right. Okay. So Chris, is there anything else about creativity and innovation that you think it's really pertinent at this point in time?
Well, I think just taking your insights about how we approach creativity generally in society, that people often see themselves as the victim of circumstances rather than being powerful, and following a kind of creative structure. So starting with, you know, germinating ideas, assimilating, completing, and the energy that can come from that. I mean, I found recently that we have another project over at the City Hospital, a gardening project, and the things that are happening there, creating something for its own sake is the first step. But then once you've done that, it's following on from what you've created, and the implications of what you created starts to spread out and synergize into areas and create an energy that I hadn't really thought about before, about the energy that creativity can generate. It will start to flow into other areas of your life. But there's the sort of energy of inspiration and insight, and that has to be followed through with, it doesn't stop there, it has to be completed. And a lot of people stop at the energy, at the germination stage, which that particular author, Robert Fritz, talks about workshop junkies, where you go to a workshop, you get inspired, but then you don't follow through. So it's quite a long process, but so long as you see it as a process over a period and with an outcome, rather than just seeing it as something that happens once, but it has to be followed through, and there's an art in following through and signing the picture at the end.
Yeah, it's about thought and action combined, isn't it? So
Yeah.
Thinking on its own without the action doesn't, you know, we can't really say that's creative. Whereas if we take action on our thoughts, then you know, that usually takes us one step forward.
Yes, and I mean, for instance, we decided that we were going to have a gardening project. We found 3 empty greenhouses at City Hospital, and they had said we could use them as a residents' association, as a way of bringing people together around growing stuff. But once you start growing stuff, then you have to find an outlet for what you've grown, and especially with 3 large greenhouses, it's quite a lot of space to use. And then we found other things, like, for instance, we were composting waste food, and the composting generates energy. So we started to use that energy to heat soil, so we could grow out of season. And then from there, we decided to design a raised bed unit, which uses that energy process, so that the unit is self-contained. So once we've done that, we have to manufacture it and sell it. So it's one thing leads to another, and once you've started something for its own sake, because that's how most people create. They do something because they want to bring something into existence that didn't exist before, but then it has a narrative of its own, and you've got to be prepared to sustain it and carry on.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I love those. I love your stories, because you, instead of like being one of these environmental protesters, instead of doing that, you're spending your time and your efforts in creating these new projects. And as you say, one thing leads to another, and all of them, you know, you've got all these different things that, you know, resources that you can use to then create additional projects.
Yes, and when you start off on the journey, you've got a horizon, what you want to achieve, but you're not quite sure how you're going to get there, and it
just do it by taking one step at a time. It's like they say, the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step.
That's right.
Excellent. Okay, well, Chris, thank you very much. It's been great speaking with you, and I'll talk to you again very soon.
Okay, thanks, Jess.
Okay then, bye for now.
Bye-bye.